Atmos 540 overhaul. Both of these are Atmos 540s. The clock on the left was just received, and as you can see, it has very low amplitude. We're looking at the balance rotation on the bottom of the clock. This clock ran for about 5 minutes and then stopped running, so I'm not quite sure what's wrong with it. We're going to look at the winding mechanism at the rear of the clock in just a moment. The clock on the right was overhauled about 2 weeks ago and is running at 600 plus degree amplitude. It had the same problem. It was running really slow. It stopped. This clock is fully wound, so I don't know what's wrong with it. We're going to have to take everything apart and clean it. As you can see by looking at the rear spring, the clock is in the fully wound position. Okay, here I have zoomed in on the fork, and the impulse roller is about ready to engage the fork. Now we should tap on that fork and then the fork should push the roller. It's not. Do you see how the roller is actually pushing the fork? Okay, so we're going to just watch that rotation one more time. So for some reason, the fork is not getting any energy from the escapement wheel. It could be that there's an issue with the main spring, or the clock is just dirty. Maybe the fork is out of poise. We're going to look at this one more time and just confirm no energy is being sent from the fork, to the impulse roller. Yeah, the roller is pushing the fork, not vice versa. This clock was a eBay purchase, and this is the description. It is in very good use condition. It's tested and seems to run well. Selling as is, no return offered. Keywords: it seems to run well. Selling as is, no returns offered. This clock ran for 5 minutes and stopped. It probably ran for 5 minutes and stopped before this person decided to sell this clock. This is fraud. If you run into this, contact eBay and get a partial refund or a total refund for your clock. That's what I did. Okay, well, we're going to start tearing into the clock. The first thing we need to do is remove the minute hand. I'm going to stick in this little spacer because my hand puller doesn't quite reach in far enough, and this will fill in the gap. Okay, time to remove the hour hand, but before I remove the hour hand, I'm going to take the dial off and the plate. This is going to give me a little bit more room to work with. Sometimes these hour hands are on so tight and they're pushed so tight against the wheel that it's really hard to get them off. You want to make sure you can do two different things. You can either pull it off with your fingers, use hand levers. I'm going to use both. I'm going to stick some hand levers underneath the hour wheel and try to pull it up as much as I can. And then I am going to use my fingers to pull that hour hand off in kind of a rolling motion where I'm putting pressure on the wheel under the hand and I'm also pulling up. You'll see that in just a minute here. So first thing we need to do is to begin protecting the wheel from the levers. And just be very careful. All right, I think we got most of this hour hand pulled up, and now I'm going to remove the paper. Use my fingers to gently hold the wheel down while I roll up. There, now perfect. Now this is the part of the overhaul where the 540 movement is very different than previous versions. This is the pulley spring. This pulley spring will need to come off of this post. It's going to make two rotations, okay? And what we're doing is now we're taking the tension off of the chain. Okay, this is what's going to be keeping tension on the chain. Now that we have that released, we're going to go ahead and move the chain through the slot and take this rear spring off. Okay, This is a very important step. These two components of the clock must be loose. See, there's no tension on anything. There's no energy built up. All of our energy right now is inside of this barrel. I believe these new movements came around in the mid 80s, and what makes them very different than the earlier iterations of the Atmos clocks is the barrel that contains the mainspring is no longer mounted to the frame. It's part of the movement. So when we pull this movement off of the clock, if you didn't follow those previous steps of releasing the bellow chain, then you would put stress on the pulley located underneath this movement. Okay, and then there's the ratchet, again, very different. This is the pulley that you could damage. Okay, but as you can see, all those little parts are in perfect condition. Before we can work on the movement, we need to release the energy from the movement. All the energy is stored in the barrel in the form of a wound up spring. So we're going to take this ratchet and we're going to keep our thumb on it, and we're going to release that ratchet spring on the top and just slowly and gently let this movement unwind. And now we can safely begin taking this movement apart. If you've never worked on a 540 movement, now is a very good time to just take a look around and get an idea of how things are assembled. Now that we've released the energy from the movement, we can begin disassembling the movement. So there are 4 screws that are going to hold the top plate to the bottom plate. We're going to remove those 4 screws, and this is a very important step. When you take this top plate off, be very careful and try not to rock the top plate off. You want to remove that top plate straight up. Now, as the components begin to separate from the top plate and the bottom plate, they're going to kind of free fall. Be very gentle with them. Let them just fall where they may. Okay, the screws are off. Now we're going to lift this plate up and just let everything fall apart. These gears are all intertwined, one layers over the other. Do not force anything. I just let everything just kind of fall where it may, and then I'll pick everything up. I'll pick up the fork. I'll take a look at the pivots, make sure nothing's broken, nothing is bent. Yeah, the fork looks pretty good. Same with all of the other components. As you're taking them out, just make sure nothing was damaged during removal. Here we can see we have intact pivots, which is good. If you needed to get this fork off of the used market, you're probably looking at around $350. So far, everything looks good. Escapement has pivots. You gotta be careful. Some of these used escapements on eBay don't have these pivots. So you would go to install these and they're completely worthless, and they're wanting $200 for an escapement with broken pivots. Okay, we're just gonna make sure that the barrel has a little bit of wind to it, which is good. Again, just take a closer look at some of these parts and pieces, make sure they're all okay. Now is a good time to use some reflective light in the ceiling to see if all of the jewels are in good condition. We're looking for cracks, chips, anything abnormal, and as I'm reflecting the light over these jewels, they look pretty good. Yeah, good. Nothing looks unusual. All right, I've cleaned the main spring in the barrel with some one dip by just letting it roll around, and then I dumped the one dip out. Since the barrel could be, or the spring could be one of the areas that we have an issue with, I want to inspect the entire spring under magnification just to make sure nothing is broken. And so far the spring looks really nice. Since we have the movement under the electronic microscope, it's a good time to just kind of look around all of the gears and wheels and make sure that everything is in good condition. You don't need equipment to do this. You can use some high magnification goggles, like a headset that you would wear to inspect everything, but we're just making sure none of the teeth are bent, nothing is broken. All of these parts have already been cleaned. I've put all my parts through the part cleaner before I do any inspections. That way I can see things a little bit easier. Again, things I'm looking for: pivots. Are all the pivots nice and round? Are they shiny? The gears, do we have all the gears are in place? Nothing's broken. This is the escapement, and this is a very important pivot to inspect. We want to make sure it's there, that it's nice and round, it's shiny, it's clean. I'm looking for sharp edges now on the teeth of the escapement. We want that to be really nice and sharp because it's going to engage the pallet stones, and we want to just snap right off of the pallet stones. We want it to engage and then pop right off. Again, we have nice pivots on the bottom of the escapement. Pallet forks, what do they look like? These pallet stones, nice and shiny. But I really want to look at the business end of the stones and look at the surface that engages the escapement. What do these look like? It looks pretty good. Pivots again, this is the pivots of the fork. And I want to look at the fork, the part that engages the impulse roller, and see if there's anything in there unusual. It's got a little bit of scratches, but for the most part, it's got a nice round edge to it. A little bit of scratches there, but that part of the fork doesn't really engage the roller. The middle part of the fork will. Okay, now is a good time to make sure that your balance tube is nice and straight, it's plumb, and it appears that we have a level that's out of level. So we can make our adjustments now before we put everything together. Okay, well, I've made some adjustments to the level, and of course the balance tube is nice and plumb. All of the adjustments that were made to the bubble were made using these push-pull screws at the bottom of the clock. This is the following morning. The clock has been sitting all night and it's in the unlocked position. We're going to watch that motif at the bottom where that toothpick was just at. So you'll notice that the balance is still swinging a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right. We're going to wait for that balance to stop moving in the left direction and begin moving right, and place a toothpick there. Now, as the balance is moving to the right, we're going to wait for that motif to stop and begin turning in the other direction and place another toothpick there. Right there. So between those two toothpicks right in the middle is going to be where the balance is going to be in beat. We're going to wait for that motif to get into that region right there. We're going to lock the balance in place and then move the impulse roller towards the center so it's perfectly in beat. Right there. Now is a good time to take all of your glass apart from the case and clean it and reassemble it, because then this way, as we're assembling the clock, we can protect it from dust. You want to make sure that you do not use any glass cleaner with ammonia over these letters, because it will take that lettering right off of the glass. So be very careful. I reassemble all of the metal components and hold them in place with rubber bands. And this is what it looks like when everything is assembled. And I keep my rubber bands on there until I'm ready to install it onto the clock. Before I install the glass on the clock, I'm just going to make sure that everything, all the dust is off of the clock. Okay, here we are going to measure the impulse roller. This impulse roller appears to be 5.5 millimeters. And we want the fork opening to be between 5.65 and 5.75 millimeters. I'm shooting for 5.7 millimeters to be exactly where we need it. So I need to pinch the forks together just a little bit more and try and get it at that 5.7 millimeters. It's getting very close. I like my forks a little bit tighter than looser because then they will end up transferring more energy to the impulse roller. When the fork moves from the left and to the right, we want to make sure that we don't have too much space between the roller and the fork. Here I'm poising the fork. The fork already appears to be perfectly poised. Okay, before I begin assembly, I'm going to just lubricate the arbor on the main barrel so that this arbor can move freely. I'm using Mobius 9020. And once the barrel has been assembled, I'm just going to test it to make sure everything's working okay, then I'm not rubbing up against the lid that I just installed. Okay, it's time to begin final assembly of the movement. I start with the large components and move from the right side of the movement or the bottom of the movement towards the top where the components get to be very small. These pivots are big, so these pivots are very easy to catch in the jewels. When we get towards the escapement and the fork, those pivots are extremely small and you want to save those for last. Now these are very free moving once all these parts go in here. That's kind of one of the disadvantages of this movement, whereas the previous movements, you kind of put them together as modular pieces. You would have bridges that got put in last for the fork, for instance, whereas now everything gets installed at the same time and we need to install the bottom plate and the top plate all as one unit. It just gets sandwiched together. It makes assembly really hard because these wheels just want to float all over the place. So right now I'm just going to make sure they're in the pivots on that lower plate before I install the escapement and the fork. Everything's moving freely. But now keep in mind, these things just want to bounce in every direction. Once we put that top plate in, we're going to have to catch, six different, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different components in the jewels at the same time. And again, when that top plate goes on, I start from the largest pivot, meaning the barrel, all the way to the left side of the movement, which will be the fork. And I just start gently pressing those in one at a time. This is kind of a bear to get in because that wheel just wants to keep pushing on my escapement. And you just have to be very patient, take your time, you're in no rush. This is where things can start to slide sideways and you break pivots. It's very delicate. We're almost approaching watch type of accuracy with how small everything is, how lightweight. All right, I think that pivot's caught. I'm just gonna gently press on it and it looks good. Okay, yeah, see how everything is just dangling all over the place. Last one to go in, of course, we have to fish the fork underneath these wheels and above other wheels and still land it in a pivot. This is a little hard for me to do like this with the camera. Usually I'm hovering over the movement with some high magnification goggles. So kind of bear with me. This isn't easy to do from a distance. Okay, the top plate has been installed. Nothing is screwed in. It's just gently pressed in place. But what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna give everything a little bit of a tug just to ensure that I did catch every pivot in a jewel. You do not want to secure anything down until you've 100% confirmed that the pivots are perfectly aligned in the jewels. So what I did is I took this to the electronic microscope and I'm going to observe these pivots in the jewels at higher magnification. This is where I feel comfortable. Once I see everything's properly installed, then I will go ahead and secure those 4 screws that hold the 2 plates together. I'm not too worried about these pivots. I can see them fairly easily. You can see that little shiny pivot in the middle of the jewel. It's these two monsters, not that one. I think we're not getting to the escapement and the fork just yet. Those two, they are so small. You want to make sure, and I'm going to improve my magnification, or I'm going to focus a little bit better here. Okay, I can see the shiny pivots are right in the middle of the jewels. I'm going to give the movement a little bit of a wiggle. Perfect. Now what we can do is flip the movement over, check the pivots on the other side, and be very careful, hold everything together. I'm placing this inside of my homemade movement holder for a 540 movement. All right, same thing. We're just going to look at everything from the other side. I just have to be very, very careful with this movement before anything gets snugged up. There's these 2 troublemakers right here, and it looks nice. I see nice shiny metal. We're going to wiggle the movement a little bit, and I can see we are good to go. All right, everything got snugged up. Seems to be working properly. Looks great. This is a close-up of the escapement. What you're going to see come into view is an oiler with some grease on it. This is Mobius Synthetic Grease 9415. We can put some drops of grease on the teeth of the escapement. What this does is this creates less friction between the escapement and the pallet fork jewels. So as you're applying energy to the forks, you're sliding across those jewels much easier, and you can release off those jewels. It's a way of increasing amplitude. This same thing is done on watches. This is the only place you'll use 9415, and this is the only movement that you will apply grease to the escapement. You do not do this with the previous generations of Atmos clocks. Okay, just a little tiny dab right there. Perfect. This is the stud for the pulley spring assembly. We're just going to use a little bit of Mobius 9020 as a lubricant. And we're going to route the chain over the pulley. Make sure all of the links are straight. Okay, we have the chain routed through the frame of the clock. We have the spring that gets pushed on by the bellow installed with the pressure plate on the back of the spring. We're making sure that the chain is nice and aligned and there's no twisting. These 3 tabs must also be engaged to the spring, so the spring is being held in place fairly loosely by these 3 tabs. You just want to make sure that that spring is in place, and this plate has the chain ran through it in a fashion where it's not going to come loose. And this is what it should look like. Now we're going to measure the distance between the frame and that plate that presses against the drum or the bellow, and we want to see 45 to 48 millimeters. Okay, now we're going to need to put some tension on this pulley. This pulley, it's going to take 2 revolutions. This pulley is what is going to keep tension on the chain when the bellow is expanding. Otherwise, that chain would just fall straight down. So this is going to pull against the chain, and we're going to push that in place There's a little notch on that post. Once you have your 2 revolutions, push it through the notch with a pair of tweezers and you're good. This is a good time to just verify operation of the springs. What I'm looking at is as the spring is being pushed, is the chain staying nice and straight? Are there any twists? If there's any twists, now is the time to take everything apart and redo it. Make sure this pulley doesn't come flying off the post. This looks pretty good. Nice and slow. Now you can see how that pulley is putting tension on that chain. After the balance has been put in beat, I'm going to unlock the balance, rotate the impulse roller to about the 9 o'clock position, and lock the balance back into place. We're now ready to install the movement back into the clock. There's only 2 screws that will hold the movement into the clock. One is at the top of the movement and the other is at the bottom. The one on the top is pretty easy to get to. The one on the bottom I'm going to do off camera because it's a little bit of a struggle to get that one in there. If you remember, we have the impulse roller at the 9 o'clock position. When I installed the movement, I kept the fork to the right side. Okay, this was for a reason. What we're going to do now is wind the movement. We want to see about 5 to 7 rotations of this ratchet. There's a little black mark right there. And as I'm winding, we're going to wind it slowly. Again, we're also going to watch the chain to make sure the chain is nice and straight. And take our time winding, pushing our chain in very nice, nice and straight. Keep everything square. I believe I ended up getting 6 rotations out of this, so that's pretty good. We got a fully wound clock. We don't want to overwind it by pressing it too much. Once we feel that there's equilibrium between the spring I'm pumping and the main spring in the barrel, we want to stop. This is a good time to put the case back over the clock and let the clock break in for a couple of days. This is a good time to make any adjustments to your fork before your dial goes on. Let this clock break in for a day or 2 before the dial and the hands go on. We're going to watch this impulse roller come into the fork. The fork is going to get moved and then the fork's going to push right there. Now we're sending energy to the clock through the fork. We're pushing the balance around. We're creating rotation. This will take 30 seconds for it to come back around and the cycle keeps on repeating. If you'll remember, when we first got this clock, the impulse roller was actually pushing the fork, not vice versa, and the clock ran for about 5 minutes. It can only do this for so long. It can't sustain that. Look, push. And we got a nice little gap between the roller and the fork, so everything moves freely. It's looking nice. Good rotation. All right, clock is back up and running, and even before I put the hands and the dial on the clock, I always let it run for a couple of days and I look at the rotation of the balance. This balance, I could only get 360-degree amplitude. We have a freshly clean clock. We have a fork that we know has been poised. It's in good condition. We have a main spring that's clean. We know it's in good condition too because we were able to get almost 6 rotations out of the barrel before the ratchet before we were putting everything together. So all the components are in good condition, the ones that we could see. What we can't see is the suspension spring. So we're going to replace the suspension spring. We don't know how this clock has been handled since 1993 when it was manufactured. Did the owners lock everything in position before they moved it, before they shipped it? If they didn't, the suspension spring becomes damaged. that spring twists like this every 30 seconds, at least 360 degrees over the entire, 24/7. If it's damaged a little bit, it will 100% affect the amplitude of the clock. So next step, everything comes back apart. The hands dial, the movement comes off, just like we did from the beginning, and we are going to take the balance out of the clock and replace the suspension spring and put it all together, begin our regulation process, and see if we can do better than 360-degree amplitude. So that will be kind of like part 2 of this video. And if this was a normal overhaul, and like this one didn't need a suspension spring replaced, it's doing great, 600-degree amplitude for the last 10 days or so. Of course, the older clock always gets new suspension springs. Once they're over 40 years old, I replace them. But I didn't expect to replace one on this clock, and we're gonna see if that's the culprit, that's the troublemaker, why we aren't getting over 360-degree amplitude. So stay tuned. All right, all of the components have been removed. We already went over that in the beginning of the video, but we are going to remove this balance from the frame by loosening the screw that is holding this peg in place and a second screw that is holding the upper regulator clamp in place right down here. It's going to be over the impulse roller. Now we are going to remove this pin so that we can release the balance. These 3 bolts will need to come off to release the clock from the base. You'll need an 8mm socket to separate the bottom portion of the balance from the balance tube. Now this is your lower regulation clamp. When you go to install the new suspension spring on this regulation clamp, do not screw it like this. You will twist the spring. You need to spin the tube, not the screw. Okay, now that we have all the parts and pieces off, now is a good time to get a nice shine on all of your parts. Get everything cleaned. We don't need this, we don't need this, we do need this. Spring, this, we're gonna keep this. And of course, our upper regulator clamp also. The new suspension spring is inserted in the upper regulator clamp and pulled through. The opposite end of the suspension spring gets the lower regulator clamp, and the razor blade is left in place to allow us to perfectly center the suspension spring into the clamp before we rotate that off. Once we rotate the razor blade off, the clamp is tight. The spring can be reinstalled in a tube. Just be very careful not to damage the spring while you are installing it in a tube. And next we can put the upper assembly of the impulse roller in place. Now we can slide the upper clamp down the suspension spring. Just like this. Perfect. Balance tube can get reinstalled on the balance, and tighten that nut up again with that wrench. Now we're going to have to set this pin between the regulator and the suspension spring to pinch it into place. So I'm taking the weight of the balance off of the clock. So I have the balance sitting on a ceramic cup that my daughter made me when she was in school, and it seems to be the perfect size to support this balance. So we're going to put the pin in place, and then we're just going to tap it with the hammer right there. That's enough. Okay, our balance tube is perfectly centered over and under the stop plate. So you see how the bottom, we have a nice little gap. Up at the top, we have a nice little gap. So now we have a balance that can move freely. This is what you're looking for. And this can take some adjustment by tapping that pin down to lower it. If it's too low, pull everything back up and then reset it. Now we're going to poise the balance. The balance has been poised using a balance poising tool that you can purchase from Time Saver. This is probably the most critical step that you can perform during an overhaul. A balance that isn't properly poised will stop a movement, will kill the movement's amplitude. So what do we mean by poising the balance? We're going to bend that tube until the upper regulator clamp is perfectly centered in the balance tube as it rotates in every direction. You do not have a lot of clearance with these 540 movements like you do with a 528, 519, Atmos 2, and so on. It's a much smaller tolerance. So what I do is I give the balance a little bit of a rotation once I've done my poising, and just watch it. Make sure that we're not touching the inside edge of the balance tube with the upper regulator clamp. This is about as good as I can get. This is going to be a nice movement, I think, or a nice clock once everything gets reassembled. After it's poised, we let it sit overnight and we put the balance back in beat. Remember how we did that at the beginning of the video? All right, I'm gonna share with you how I put a balance in beat. This balance has been sitting all night, but it still rotates even after sitting all night. So I set up two screwdrivers. The one on the left is, we're gonna watch that motif that's right now over the middle screwdriver. And it's only going to rotate as far as the screwdriver on the right. So what I do is I watch these balances. Once they stop, I'll put a screwdriver underneath that location. Okay, so right there it stopped. It's gonna reverse direction and come back in the other direction. Again, I can't believe how much these balances rotate even after sitting here all night long undisturbed. Okay, so right there, we know that we have the motif is in the middle of those two screwdrivers, right? The screwdriver on the left represents the furthest that motif will rotate to the left, and the one on the right represents the furthest the motif will rotate to the right. Now we can take our impulse roller and we can move it in any direction because we're loose. That spring on the bottom of the impulse roller, that screw on it hasn't been set yet. So we can rotate this right there, try and get it as perfectly centered as possible with the balance being locked in place. And then we can pull that spring down and lock that screw in place. That's gonna put a little bit of tension on that impulse roller so that when the fork pushes the roller, it doesn't make it spin around and get out of beat. It just gives it enough tension to keep it in place, but it can still move, so you have to be very careful. The impulse roller, even with this tension, can still move just a little bit. All right, if you made it this far, congratulations, you did a complete overhaul. So after the movement has been put in beat, we can go ahead and install the movement. We can install the dial, the hands, and begin our regulation process. All of that was already covered in another video, so we don't need to go over that again. Okay, so we have a new suspension spring installed. We know we've changed the geometry of the clock, and the suspension spring is a little bit thicker than the original equipment was. So we're gonna have to add weights. And when I started this, let's see, we started this on July 6th at 4 o'clock. We had 420-degree amplitude. Not that great, still pretty good. Anything over 450 I really like to see. but the clock is still breaking in. These 540s will take a few days to break in. The first day we were running 45 minutes fast. That's quite a bit. So what you need to do is begin to add weights to slow the movement down, and that really doesn't affect the amplitude that much. You would think it would, but it doesn't. So we were up to 495-degree amplitude. And then within a day, I was able to, using weights, calculating how much weights I need per minute, I was able to get myself down to being slow by 1 minute and 39 seconds a day. Okay, so now we are under 3 minutes a day regulation. Okay, so you want to add weights on the clock until you can regulate it to plus or minus 3 minutes a day. Once you can get those tolerances that tight, you can begin regulating with the regulator clamp up at the top. So I was 1 minute, 39 seconds slow. So I just started making some rotations with a lever to try to speed things up. Yesterday, I was running at 510-degree amplitude. And this morning at 7:30, I was running at 510-degree amplitude. I will check the clock again at 4 p.m. to see how I'm running. The way I check the clock is I just use the stopwatch feature on the clock or on my phone. And when the clock reaches the 4 o'clock position on this clock, not 4 o'clock during the day, it's usually off by a few minutes. You know, you can see some of these other clocks are off because of the regulation process. But once I hit 4 o'clock on this clock, I hit start. The next day I come back at 4 o'clock on this clock, I hit, I think it's the lapse button. And then I can see, am I running fast? Am I running slow? I can make an adjustment and then check it the next day and so on until you are within whatever you want to be, 5 seconds a day, 2 seconds a day. I like to see between 1 and 2 seconds fast a day. That way, if I'm running fast, I know I can lock the clock, let it catch up with real time, and unlock it. I don't have to do any moving around of anything. So the regulation process begins. I will probably have this clock regulated within the next couple of days, and I can reinstall the base while it's regulating. I like to keep the nice clean glass on it and make sure that it stays dust free. And you'll notice we got pretty good rotation out of this clock, much better than 360 degrees. This is what I want to see. This is why when you overhaul a clock and you have an overhauler that doesn't put in a new suspension spring, you really want to have that work done if it needs it. A lot of guys will overhaul, but they don't do the suspension springs. They're really hard to install. I know clock repair men who have burned through 5 of these suspension springs. There's part of the spring right here laying around. That's how small it is. It's a little bit bigger than a hair. So I know guys who had burned through 5 of these springs before they finally got one right, because they will kink them. They kink very easily. They will bend them. Once they bend them or kink them, they're done. You gotta throw it away and get a new one. I always order at least 5 or 6 at a time. I do enough work where I'm always installing new suspension springs on clocks. So, okay, we're gonna let this finish regulating, and maybe by the time this is done regulating, everything will be put back together and we can look at the final clock. In the beginning of the video, I did not share with you the fact that when I took the bellow drum off of the clock and inspected the bellow was flat. And this is pretty unusual for this model of clock, but as you can see, a repair was made right here to the bellow. It was probably leaking from day one. Okay, the bellow has been brought up to room temperature, and these measure a little bit differently than other clocks. We should be at least right around 23 millimeters from the top of the bellow to the edge of the drum, and we are at 24 millimeters. So this indicates that the refill was successful, and this is a good bellow. Now I'm going to reinstall the case and its base into the glass. This is the opposite of how I take things apart. At the very beginning, I didn't show you that part, but this is how I reinstall. Everything's held in place with rubber bands, the clock is dropped in, and then the 4 screws are installed. And here's our finished clock. The clock is running at 510 degree amplitude. It is running plus 1.4 seconds per day. These 540s are very, very difficult clocks to overhaul. I do not recommend this for the amateur. Please contact me at this email address or go to my website for information on overhauling your clock.